Hi, everyone. I'm Zoe, and I'm going to be talking about game theory and how procurement can use game theory to maximize and improve their negotiation outcomes. Okay, a little bit about myself. So, I work at a company called NERA. We're a subsidiary of Oliver Wyman. And within NERA, I work within a practice with economists and game theorists like myself. And we work to help companies in the private sector and in the public sector with projects involving game theory. And specifically, what I do is I work with procurement companies who are looking to leverage game theory in their negotiation designs to help them improve the outcomes of their negotiations. Before working at NERA, I worked internally at Philips, internally in their procurement organization, helping to build their negotiation center of excellence. We were sort of an internal consulting team that was supporting buyers on the direct side and the indirect side in helping to leverage game theory and designing their negotiations and really helping to run the end-to-end negotiation process. At a larger level, we were helping Philips kind of with this organizational change, moving from the traditional way of negotiating to this new way using game theory. So having been internal, I'm well aware and very familiar with all of the challenges that come up with stakeholders and suppliers and the resistance that you get when you're trying to do something in a new way and change something that's so ingrained in an organization. All right, so a little bit about NERA. We don't have to spend too much time here, but basically, like I said, we're part of Oliver Wyman, which is part of Marsh McLennan. We work in designing negotiations all around the world. You can read more about NERA. This is not the point of today. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? So the first part of today, we're going to talk about why are we here? Why should we even care about game theory at all? Why is game theory relevant? We're then going to do a bit of Game Theory 101, which hopefully feels like a fun class and might be a little bit interactive. And finally, we're going to talk about game theory and procurement and really making it practical and applicable and moving a little bit away from the theory and towards how do we really embed these theoretical principles in our negotiations. All right, so why are we here? All right, so as my work is a consultant and both internally at Philips, I have come across the clear trend that over time, suppliers have gained the upper hand in their negotiations. And how that manifests is that companies have been overpaying for their procurement spend because the way they're negotiating doesn't give suppliers the right incentives to get more competitive and more aggressive and to lower their prices. In traditional organizations, you see a very high reluctance to switch suppliers. Stakeholders have very strong preferences or relationships with the suppliers. People are risk averse. People prefer doing things the way that they know versus trying something new. And what happens is that suppliers perceive this reluctance to switching and they act accordingly. So incumbent suppliers might feel very comfortable. They don't continue to give you the best prices and stay competitive because they know they're very well embedded in the organization. Challenger suppliers maybe think, oh, I don't even know if I have a real chance to win this business. Maybe I'm just getting benchmarked. I'm also not going to participate in the most meaningful way. And so over time, procurement organizations get locked in with the same suppliers year after year and become increasingly dependent on them and start losing their leverage in the market. And so the point is the way that a lot of companies have been running negotiations is not giving suppliers the right incentives to get more aggressive and to lower their prices or to improve on whatever commercial objectives you're working towards in the negotiation. Okay, so as a result, I have seen more procurement organizations turn to game theory to help the buyers regain that advantage in their negotiations. And exactly how game theory can help, we're going to get to, but just a couple of examples of how I've seen that. So first, companies are investing in a dedicated game theory center of excellence, kind of like the one that I was part of at Philips, that helps support the procurement organization internally in doing negotiations a new way. Second, companies have been hiring external game theory consultants like myself who are advising on negotiation strategy and execution. And finally, companies have been investing in e-sourcing platforms that have flexible auction platforms in them that enable the use of game theory and game design to help improve the negotiation outcomes. So on the right, these are just a handful of companies that I've seen do this first thing, which is build this game theory center of excellence. Both companies I've worked with directly and others who I've just come across that I've seen who have been building up the same type of capability. And so just to show, it's widespread across companies from many different industries. Okay, so Game Theory 101. Game theory is a term that I feel like gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of cool and hip, but I'm not sure that it's always really explained what it means. So I want to start from the beginning and just with the definition of game theory, and then we'll build upon why it's relevant. Okay, so game theory is a study of interactive decision-making between multiple parties where the outcome for each player in the interaction depends on the actions of all. So that's really the key differentiator. You have multiple parties in an interaction or a negotiation, and the outcome for each of the parties is depending on the actions that are taken by all the parties. So a couple of examples on the bottom that help kind of draw this distinction. On the top, you see, okay, game theory is relevant in these ones in green. So rock, paper, scissors. If I'm playing rock, paper, scissors with someone, whether I win is going to depend on what I throw out and what they throw out. Same with penalty kicks. If the kicker goes left, middle, or right, and the goalie goes left, middle, or right, that's going to affect whether a goal is scored or not. Poker depends on my hand and my betting and, my strategy, and the same thing of my opponent. Now, not to get ahead of ourselves, but you can think about how in a procurement situation, whether or not a supplier wins a bid depends on how they bid and how everybody else bids as well. Situations on the bottom where game theory is not as relevant are things like crossword puzzle, bowling, slots, where it's really just you versus luck or versus time or, as doing things as fast as you can or as best as you can. And those are not situations where game theory is as relevant. Okay, so once we're looking at a game where we can use game theory to analyze it, we want to think about how do we define and how do we solve these games. So we think about games as defined by three things. Who are the players in the game? That one is kind of self-explanatory. What are the strategies available to the players in the game? So like I'm going to throw rock or paper or scissors, or I'm going to alternate half-half. Like what am I going to do as my strategy? And that oftentimes is governed by the rules of the game. And finally, what are the payoffs of the game? So things like what are all the combinations of strategies? What are the possible payoffs and outcomes that the players can get through these combinations? Now, games obviously can have a lot of outcomes, but you can figure out which outcome is most likely and predict that outcome by finding the equilibrium of the game. Now, equilibrium is kind of this like fancy word, but really what it means is that in this outcome, if it's an equilibrium, no player can do better by changing their strategy and getting a better payoff, right? So holding everything else the same, nobody can do better by changing their strategy. And if that's the case, then the game's in equilibrium. And you can find whether or not an outcome is in equilibrium and whether it's most likely by thinking about, what are all these players' best responses to the other player's actions? And by going through this exercise, you can find whether or not a game is going to be in equilibrium or not in a certain outcome. And we're going to do that example in a minute. So like I said, to test whether an outcome is in the equilibrium, you can ask, does any player under this outcome have an incentive to deviate from their strategy that got them to this outcome or not? And if they do have an incentive to deviate and they can do better, then the game's not in equilibrium. But if nobody can do any better by changing their strategy, then the game is in equilibrium. Okay, so we're now going to kind of explain this by using one of the most probably classic, famous examples in game theory, which is the prisoner's dilemma. Does anyone here know what the prisoner's dilemma is? Yeah, couple, remember it from school, read about it? Okay, good. So you're not allowed to speak when I ask for the answer. Okay, so the prisoner's dilemma. Here's the situation. We have two criminals that rob a bank. They get the money and they hide the money. They get caught by a policeman without the money, but he really has a feeling that they robbed this bank and he's trying to get a confession out of them. The policeman takes the two criminals and puts them in two separate rooms. And he gives them the exact same offer. He says, you can deny or confess to this bank robbery crime. And the only rule is that they must decide simultaneously, right? So it's not like one of them decides and then he tells the other one and then they decide. They decide separately, simultaneously. So we're going to think about this in terms of players, strategies, and payoffs. The players in this game are criminal 1 and criminal 2. The strategies available to them are they can deny the crime or they can confess to the crime. And the payoffs are put in front of them by the policeman as follows. If you both deny the crime separately, you're both going to go to jail for 1 year. If you both confess to the crime separately, you're both going to go to jail for 6 years. And if one confesses and one denies, the confessor's going to go free and the denier is going to get 10 years in jail. So when we think about payoffs, lower numbers is good, right? Because we're talking about jail time. So the lower, the better for them. All right, we're going to set this up in just this 2x2 matrix here to show these payoffs with one of them confessing, denying, and so forth. So if both of them deny, they both go to jail for 1 year. So you can see that on the top, we have criminal 1. Their payoffs are in white and black, and then criminal 2 is in blue and white. So deny gets you 1-1. If they both confess gets you 6-6. Both of them go to jail for 6 years. And if one of them denies and one of them confesses, the denier is going to go free. And the confessor is going to go free, and the denier is going to go to jail for 10 years. So you can see on the top, criminal 1 denies, he gets 10, and 2 confesses, they get 0. So confessing, if the other one denies, the confessor goes free, and the denier gets 10 years in jail. Okay, so thinking about this idea of an equilibrium, which one of these 4 outcomes do you think is the equilibrium of the game? So I'm just going to ask for hands to be raised. Who thinks that deny, 1 year each, is the equilibrium? Handful. Okay. Who thinks that deny, confess is the equilibrium? Nobody? Who thinks confess is the equilibrium? Okay, so we have a handful for confess, and a handful for deny. Before I go on, does everyone understand the matrix here? Do I need to explain it again? Any questions? I know it's kind of weirdly set up. Okay. So, what? Yeah. Right, because the money's hidden, right? So the money's gone. This is about jail time. Agreed. Totally. Let's pretend for this example, the cop is trying to optimize jail time alone. Okay? The cop is loaded, okay? He won the lottery a few weeks ago, doesn't need any money. There you go. Fair enough. Okay. So let's think through the outcomes. Okay, so if both of them deny, right, we thought about, okay, can anybody do better by doing something different? Can anyone improve their outcome by doing something different? What do we think? Yes, right, because there's someone who's getting 1 year who can switch and confess and get 0 years, right? So one of them has an incentive to deviate and do something else. What about in this situation? Can anyone do any better? Yeah, right, because the person who's getting 10 can deviate and confess and get 6 years. Okay, what about this? 6-6. Can anyone do any better by individually doing something? No, right? Because if either of them switch from confess to deny, they're going to get 10 years. So this is the best that they can do in this situation, and nobody can improve their outcome by doing something on their own. So confess is the equilibrium of the game, and that's why it's called the dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, because they would love to end up in this 1-1 box. But the rules and the incentives set by the policeman force them into this 6-6 box. Another way you can see this is by just looking at the best response of them. So if you assume that criminal 1 confesses, 2 can confess or deny, they're going to do better confessing and getting 6 instead of 10. Same thing, if they assume criminal 1 is going to deny, you can compare 0 to 1 and see you're going to do better by confessing as well. And the same thing is true the other way, it's just mirrored, and that you see that confessing is always better, and that's how we end up in this confess box. So even though it's counterintuitive, even though they would like to end up in the 1-1 box, no matter what the other criminal does, they're always going to do better confessing. And that's because of the strategies and the rules and the incentives set up by the policeman. Okay, so I know we've been talking about the prisoners a lot and what they should do to solve this game the best, but I want to turn the attention to the policeman a little bit because, like I said, the outcome of the prisoner's dilemma is not a coincidence at all. It doesn't just happen that they end up in this 6-6 box. It is forced by the payoffs and the rules set by the policeman based on what the policeman wanted. The policeman wanted them to go to jail for as long as possible, and he set up these specific rules. And if the rules and the design was different, the outcome would have been different. So What if the prisoners were allowed to talk before their decision? What if the payoffs for confessing or denying were different? What if the prisoners made their decisions sequentially? So one of them decided and then the other one heard and then decided. All of these different designs would have resulted in a different outcome. And that's really the point I want to get across when we move kind of into thinking about procurement, is that the design of this game really mattered in forcing the outcome. And what we call here is, economists call this mechanism design or game design. And basically the idea is that you can deliberately shape the outcome of the game that you want by making deliberate decisions around the design of the game. And what happens is that if you are the designer of the game and you get to set the rules of the game, the advantage is yours as well. So in this case, the policeman had the advantage. He was the rule setter, and so he got to set the rules of the game to force these confessions and as much time in jail as possible. But in supplier negotiations, which we're now going to talk about, procurement is the policeman. Procurement is the one that gets to set up the rules to force the outcomes that they want. All right, game theory and procurement. So we're going to get a little more practical now. So the supplier's dilemma. I don't want to spend too much time here. I'm wary of time, but I'm going to show you kind of a parallel example to what we just talked about. So pretend you're running a tender. You have two suppliers that are completely equal, competing for your business. You're completely indifferent between them. And the rule is the lowest offer gets awarded the business. And if both offer the same price, they split the money, they split the profit equally. They split the business 50-50. And assume you know their cost structures, we're making a lot of assumptions here, and that the profit at the high price, if they win the business, is $6 million, and the profit at a low price is $4 million. And again, the one rule, the offers have to be made simultaneously. It's not like one of them bids high-low and then the other one bids high-low. Okay, so very similarly, we have players, the two suppliers. Strategies, they can go high or low. Payoffs, if they both go high, they split $6 million. They both go low, they split $4 million. And if one goes high and one goes low, the one who went low gets the whole business at $4 million. Okay, so we're going to do the exact same thing. Set this up. High, they each get 3. Low, they each get 2. And high-low, the low gets the full business at $4 million and the high gets nothing. Okay, what do we think is the outcome here? High? Low? Yeah? Low? Yeah, exactly. And the dynamic is the same, right? If they had both offered a high price, one of them could have done better by going low and getting an extra $1 million. But in this situation, the other one could have also done better by switching to low as well. And so you're in this low situation. And so what happens is that, again, just like with the prisoner's dilemma, the suppliers would love to end up in this high price market and keeping prices high and getting a lot of margin, but you can design the negotiation to force them into a specific outcome that you want. All right, so I know that was very kind of simplified and hypothetical, but I wanted to introduce that kind of mirrored game to obviously show the parallels to the prisoner's dilemma, but also to introduce this idea that as the game designer, procurement can specifically design their supplier negotiations in a way to optimize their outcomes. Every negotiation is different in terms of what you're negotiating, with whom you're negotiating, and for what objectives. And so that means that every negotiation design also needs to be a little bit different. And so the task facing procurement is to design the right game for the negotiation that they are up against. Now, what that means is making all of the little decisions around players and strategies and payoffs to give them the outcome that they want. So what does that mean? Players. So which suppliers should we include or exclude from this negotiation? Do we have an incumbent? Are we going to include them? Are we going to treat them a specific way? Are there challenger suppliers? How many challenger suppliers are there? If we run a final auction or bid or something, how many players should be in that final round? Like, what are the numbers that make the most sense for us? Strategies. Strategies means, how can suppliers make offers? Are we doing an auction where they can bid against each other? Are we giving them offers that they can accept or reject? How long do they have to give us offers? In what format? If there's a tie, what are the tie break rules? Like, all of these things are going to impact the strategies available to the suppliers when they're thinking about bidding. And payoffs, you cannot obviously affect the cost structure of your suppliers, but you can change the size of the pie available for them to win. So How long is the contract duration? That changes how big the business is. Are we going to dual source or are we going to single source? If we do dual source, are we going to have the shares be 50-50 or 80-20, right? All of these things are going to affect the size of the pie available for them to win. And finally, this last one, which is information and controlling the amount of information that goes to the suppliers, I wanted to touch on quickly because information is a very deliberate thing that either you have to think about exactly when it makes sense to share what pieces of information. Suppliers are going to try to break out of this supplier's dilemma and keep the advantage in the negotiation. And one of the most common ways they do that is by trying to get information out of you. So how many suppliers are there? Am I in the lead? How far am I from the lead? Who's the other supplier? But all of these questions are them trying to get more information to get the advantage of the negotiation back from you. So you need to be very deliberate and conscious with what information you share with suppliers, when you should do it, and in what way. So I know that these are a lot of decisions, but I think that these decisions are happening sort of subconsciously already. So I just want to make you aware of all the options available to you and show you that you have all of this control to make these specific decisions to shape your negotiations. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about auctions. I highlighted it as one of the strategies before, but in my opinion, auctions are one of the strongest game design tools available for buyers. This whole thing kind of started with an auction. We had supplier dilemma where they could bid low or high. And in this situation, this was just a sealed bid auction, the sealed bid single round auction. I don't think that auctions are always the best choice for all negotiations, but when they are, they really do yield very, very strong results compared to other negotiation methods when they're used the right way. Why? So first, auctions incentivize suppliers to get more competitive by making competition visible. So many times suppliers are left in the dark with who are the competitors, how many, do I even have any competition? And you can pick the right auction format to make that competition visible to them. The second is that auctions encourages suppliers to participate in the negotiation due to the fact that auctions are normally very transparent and fair. And so what this means is that, sometimes suppliers are really in the dark with exactly how a sourcing decision is being made. Is this the final round that I can submit an offer? Is some stakeholder making the final decision? Are they going to come back to me for another offer? Are they going to someone else? There's so much flexibility on the side of the buyer that suppliers are sometimes left in the dark with really, what do I need to do to win the business? And when is the selection happening? And how is it happening? If you structure your auctions in the right way and communicate the rules in the right way, they know exactly what they need to do to win the business. And they know that procurement stakeholders have signed off on honoring that outcome. Transparency doesn't just mean to, tell them everything, how many bids, who the bids are from, what the bids are. It means being very clear about the process that you're going to use to award the business. And finally, auctions are great because they eliminate stakeholder biases that are always so present in a lot of negotiations. So like I said in the beginning, stakeholders have a lot of preferences about who they want to win the business. Sometimes those are very valid and grounded in real value differentiators, but sometimes they're not, and they're biased, and they're based on relationships or experience or whatever reason that might feel real to them. So taking stakeholders through the process of preparing for a competitive negotiation like an auction helps kind of weed out what is just bias and what's real value differential that we need to incorporate in the auction. So yeah, I like auctions. I see them really outperform other types of negotiations. 7-10%, sometimes up into 30% based on, whether it might be a small business that's really being taken advantage of by their suppliers. So they're not always relevant, but when they are, I think auctions are very strong. Quick thing about auctions and thinking about when they're relevant, I want to highlight kind of these couple of things. So first is, when can auctions be applied? The business has to be attractive to suppliers. They have to be willing to engage in kind of this new way of doing things to win the business. The second is you need 2 eligible suppliers at least. I don't believe in running auctions only with one supplier. And third, I've touched on this a couple of times, but you need this internal commitment from the business to actually go through with the awarding from the auction. You can't run an auction where someone thinks they won the business and then you say, oh, we're just going to do, one more sanity check. And, the suppliers need to know that the winner is the winner. And if you can't generate that commitment on your side, then an auction might not be the best for you. This is to say that in considering when to run an auction, I think that the market should make the decision for you, not the category per se. Like I said in the beginning, auctions are not always relevant, but just because you're negotiating in a certain category doesn't make, take it off the table completely. There's a lot of creative ways to run competitive awardings in all sorts of categories. So here's just a list of categories that I've run auctions in. We don't have to go through all of them, of course, but I've just highlighted a couple where, sometimes I get a lot of pushback or confusion, like how can we do this in our category? So in real estate and in construction, consultants, professional services, IT, all sorts of freight and warehousing, I've all seen this be really successful when the situation is right and when the auction is designed in the right way. Okay, so just like a bigger game, if you're running an auction, it's not one size fits all. And these are a couple of things that you want to keep in mind when coming with an auction and all the decisions that you need to make. What is the auction format? Are we going to do an ascending auction or a descending auction? What's the level of visibility that we want to give suppliers in the auction? Do we want to tell them if they're the leader or not? If they have a ranking or not? Are we just going to let them see all bids, which is sometimes completely fine? Third is the bundle. So what's kind of the size of the business we're going to put into the auction? Are we going to put it all up at once? Are we going to make spend packages? Are we going to introduce those packages at the same time or sequentially? What is the sequence? And finally, the pricing rules. So where is the auction going to start? What are the increments? And maybe what's the price that we have to get to even award the business at all? So I know, again, a lot of decisions to be made when designing an auction or a competitive negotiation. But the point is that all of these decisions are just little moments for power for you to come up with, what's the best design for me in this negotiation. So I hope that you take away from this that you have all of these tools available at your disposal and you can think about what's the best combination that's going to give me the outcome I want in the negotiation that I'm running. So have a couple minutes for questions, but just some key takeaways. We talked about game theory, which is a study of interactive decision-making, where the outcome for each player depends on the actions of all players. And we saw that in the prisoner's dilemma and then relevant in the supplier's dilemma. Game theory can help procurement take the upper hand in their supplier negotiations with the right selection of players and strategies and payoffs in a way to optimize their outcomes. And finally, auctions are a very effective negotiation design as they yield more competitive offers and encourage supplier participation and can eliminate biases. Okay, this thing here says there's 2 minutes for questions. So I think we should be okay. Any questions? Ernie? Oh, yeah. Mm. Yeah. So I'm not associated with any technology platform or anything like that. We are not a tool. We don't have a tool. So I've just seen tools get implemented at other companies, or I've worked with them who have had tools and they've tried to figure out how to use auction. I'm a big believer that the method in running the negotiation gets you 95% of the way to the results. And the tool might give some level of shine or fanciness or legitimacy. But I've run $200 million auctions over email at the start of COVID and it went completely fine. So I don't think you need to have a tool to do all of this. In terms of which tools are using game theory, it's more so that tools should have the options available for you to pick design elements that you want. So I've, worked at some companies that had very limited auction tools that couldn't take into account differences between suppliers in the auction, which is just table stakes for wanting to run a competitive negotiation at all, right? So there was only one auction format and they were not able to take into account at all. And then you have the Coupas of the world, which have sourcing optimization and the ability for suppliers to dynamically on the fly make their own bundles and change the package of the thing that they're bidding for. And that is great, but also sometimes way more complex than some companies are using. So I would think about it more when you're looking at tools of, does this tool give me the menu that I want to make the choices I want in the design? And less so is this tool itself using game theory? Because the game theory should be in your brain and then the tool should give you a way to execute it with in your negotiations. Does that help? Maybe? Okay, I'm at 0, but I could do. Thank you. So yeah, so this was back when I was at Philips. We were negotiating licenses within their Microsoft platform, and we had um, 5 vendors that were competing for us to have their license. We gave the incumbent an offer reduced by X% savings, and we won't go to an auction. I think it was like 5% or 7% or something. They said no. We said, okay, we're going to go to an auction. So they had right of first refusal. They said no. We went to an auction. They joined the auction anyway, and they won the business at like 12 or 13% savings. So they should have accepted in the beginning. Yep. Okay. Thank you.